8 balls, American Sign Language, prison guards. The visual world of Martin Wong could seem pretty hard to make sense of, but there's ultimately a very distinct formal and thematic unity across his diverse body of work. The unique mix of subject matter and voice that often makes countercultural writers or poets memorable and distinctive. Curated by Chris Greuchhuizen and Agustin Perez Rubio, Malicious Mischief is Wong's most comprehensive retrospective to date, and his first in Europe. Initiated by the KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin, and produced in collaboration with CA2M Madrid, Camden Art Centre, and the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, the show has maintained a general shape while adapting to each venue. Though the less institutional vibe of the ex-library building in Camden and the old margarine factory of KW probably served the subversive, scabrous quality of the work best. There's a fundamental outsider-insider character to both the work and to the artist, who like to wear cowboy hats and shirts, biker jackets, and, occasionally, firefighters' uniforms, slipping between communities and identities. From Haight-Ashbury hippie to Lower East Side tough guy. A lifelong collector of antiques and cheap figurines, he also felt an equal sense of identification with pop culture characters and animistic figures from Chinese mythology, an affinity reflected in early sculptures from the late 60s. In work of this time, there's a particular identification with the Wile E. Coyote, perhaps reflecting the Warner Brothers cartoon's constant themes of pursuit and evasion, underdog determination, as well as older, mythic ideas of the coyote as trickster, an enigmatic shapeshifter, a being of two worlds. A queer Chinese American living in late 1970s Manhattan, Wong would go on to explore ideas of freedom and imprisonment, whether of the body, of the city, identity, language. Finding a certain freedom in imprisonment, learning to embrace the wall, painting himself a way through. In Charlie Ahern's 1998 video profile of the artist, Wong recalls finding a toy building painted with miniature bricks, a key moment that unlocked a lifelong obsession with the motif. A brick wall might be the ultimate symbol of impenetrability, but for Wong, it represented a form of creative liberation. The individually rendered bricks are a busy, anti-aesthetic form of over-detailing. Laid over curved, ballooning forms, they are the painterly equivalent of R. Crumb's overly cross-hatched comics. Yet they're also reassuring in their regularity, as opposed to Crumb's sense of visual itch and agitation. The rounded, exaggerated brick is a visual principle that runs throughout Wong's work, in everything from its general morphology to the physicality of its surface, to its themes of bodies and buildings, urban incarceration and fluidity, hardness and softness. The forms, like the paint itself, both fluid and crusty at the same time, spiky and soft. As Peter Doig elegantly put it in a recent interview with Luncheon magazine, Wong's vision and ideas are articulated by his technique, which is subversive and roughly crafted, albeit with immense finesse and painterly touch. Again and again with Wong, we find limiting structures, brick walls, magic 8 balls with their sense of endgame, traffic signs, hand gestures, deafness and disability, city streets, storefront shutters, prisons and guards, the body, racial caricature and cultural stereotype. Everywhere he sees barriers, restrictions, limitations. And each time he deploys these limiting structures, he finds some element of ecstatic or apocalyptic freedom within them. Along with the bricks, one of Wong's most persistent forms is the eyeball or 8-ball motif. Less obvious than the brickwork, it's a kind of painterly signature which appears even in this very early costume study from his time working in experimental theatre. a descending circle shape like a sphere with highlights, which sometimes becomes a cartoonish eyeball. It's a compulsive gesture which reappears constantly throughout his body of work, coming back in fingernails and cufflinks, in sinkholes and metal bunks in the prison paintings, even hiding in the holes in baseball caps. A form he appears to have had an instinctual bodily affinity with. It finds its fullest and most blatant expression in the 8-ball paintings. Tell My Troubles to the 8-ball, Eureka, lays out Wong's cosmic sense of the shape, framed as it is by googly-eyed skulls and twinkling stars. A kind of all-seeing and unseeing eye. The blinded 8-ball speaks of mysticism and surveillance, omniscience and cosmic or state voyeurism. It's the yin to the brick's yang, their spherical opposite and equal. The final ball in a game of pool, the 8-ball relates to themes of luck, fate, and death, but also the infinite, should its number roll to the side. Combining associations of Asian iconography and mythologized Americana, along with last man standing lone wolfism, the 8-ball has become an inescapable presence in everything from tattoos to streetwear, famously forming a core motif of skate and surf brand Stuss's ultra-hip image, something that Wong's picture predates, but which it certainly doesn't preclude. Wreathed in flame, like something painted on the side of a hot rod, it's his most striking image. At this point, almost a logo. Eyeball and stud, sphere and hole. The shape is another cipher for the artist, who once called himself the human instamatic. A giant eye who sees and records everything, passing no judgment. Between the bricks and 8-balls, perhaps Wong's most singular pictorial device is the signing hand. In another chance encounter, he was riding the subway one day when he was given a card by a deaf person. Printed on the back was the American manual alphabet. Wong had just read a newspaper headline about the son of Sam Killer, claiming he'd been acting under the instruction of a demonic dog. The collision of unfamiliar, arcane, and sensational language sparked the painting Psychiatrists Testify, Demon Dogs Drive Man to Murder. Wong would build up a substantial collection of manual alphabet cards and pamphlets, and the signing hands would become a lasting preoccupation. Playing into his fascination with repetition and confinement, the paintings for the hearing impaired, as he problematically called them, would explore the formal possibilities within the set number of combinations available to a 5-digit hand and a 26-letter alphabet. Starting off fleshy, pudgy even. Gradually they became stretched, decorative, almost resembling Kufic script. Like his poetry, they start to become about informational density, something to be seen as much as read. Blown up to billboard size, the signing starts to become a metaphor for communicative confusion and fragmentation. Their messages coming across in a kind of semantic slow motion. Always, Wong adds traction to language in order to tease it out, show it off. Literally dragging it out, prolonging its normally lightning-fast action. But, as obviously energised and fascinated as Wong was by ASL, at this point, the amount of appropriation going on is unavoidable. Ultimately, he was a hearing person using ASL, and, importantly, misusing it. Spelling out words is not at all how signing works in any language, meaning they're as difficult to read for both deaf and hearing audiences, something Wong highlighted in his traffic signs. Made in collaboration with the Department of Transportation, they would have been unlikely to actually assist anyone crossing the street or driving the school bus. And that's part of the point. Wong's sign paintings alienate hearing and non-hearing audiences alike. He makes everyone an outsider, except perhaps himself. The eternal hipster initiate, always on the inside of the outside. It's also important to note that the sign language is there not only for notions of disability and disenfranchisement, but for its more esoteric connotations. Dryly commenting on the silent world of painting, they also recall the gestures of blessing in images of gods and gurus. They also bring to mind the work of the 20th century painter Marsden Hartley, his mix and match mysticism incorporating yogic mudras and the writings of Jacob Boehme, but also a thinly veiled homoeroticism. ASL is a bodily, literally carnal language after all, and it's not hard to see Wong's signing hands in a similar light to Hartley's idiosyncratic system of emblematic signage and queer coding. Still, contemporary audiences may balk at a hearing artist misusing a language that was not his own, just as we might wince at certain items in his collection, his sometimes problematic interest in racist kitsch and cultural stereotype. Wong would later be reappropriated himself by the Supreme clothing line, something the contrarian artist would have probably embraced, but which the curators of Malicious Mischief completely avoided. It's worth noting that Supreme drew the line at using any of the signing works, perhaps wisely. There's a world of difference between incorporating another language into paintings and incorporating it into mass-produced items designed solely for profit. And yet, part of the painting's appeal, surely, is the perceived edginess they pull in from marginalised subcultures and communities. As with all appropriation, its harmful potential depends on who's appropriating what and to what ends. In Wong's case, the viewer will have to decide for themselves. Something it's easy to forget in the sanitised institutional museum environment is that Wong was never a cosy, wholesome artist. Painting is forbidden, he wrote in the mid-1980s. The joys and pleasures of being a painter are almost identical to those of being a serial killer. The solitary quest, the thrill of the hunt, the compulsion of trying to complete an imaginary set. To live totally in the imagination. In the end, painting is also similar to murder, in that when the thrill is finally gone, all you have left is a mess and a disposal problem. This may be way over the top. Wong's tongue somewhere close to his cheek, but his paintings often have something of the cathode glare of the late-night TV news about them. A distinct sense of urban dread. Fevered imaginings. New York's cacophony of languages and signs came to a grisly endgame in The Son of Sam case. A triangulation of violent crime, esoteric references, and lurid sensationalism that couldn't fail to appeal to Wong's imagination, whether in poor taste or not. Perhaps he even felt a jolt of recognition when he saw the killer's notes to the police. Either way, the mythic figure of the deranged killer holed up in his apartment plays into Wong's vision of the city as an inferno, where charged relationships within communities and between communities and the authorities are always on the point of boiling over, where apartment blocks look like the desert adobes of George Herriman's Crazy Cat under incendiary red skies. But he also doesn't limit himself to misery and squalor. Like the soundstage sets of Rainer Werner Fassbinder's Querelle, there's a knowing, exaggerated quality to Wong's urban landscape. A steamy, end-of-the-world dance of crime and romance. Wong's palimpsest of language also has more positive, transformative implications beyond feelings of paranoia and confusion. As much as the pressures of sharing limited space can result in casualties, the life of the city is its multiplicity, especially in New York.
But I just love that, the Lower East Side of this neighborhood is, as vibrant as ever, and it's so beautiful. It's great.
Attorney Street Handball Court. A painting recognised and purchased by the Met during Wong's lifetime, is a summation of his linguistic obsessions, incorporating ASL, graffiti, and a poem by the writer and occasional actor Miguel Pinheiro, in a single testimonial image that almost recalls Maurice Utrillo's devotional images of Montmartre. The graffitied wall taking the place of a dappled sky, offering a small sketch of urban transcendence. Pinheiro, a key figure in establishing a Puerto Rican literary movement in the neighbourhood, pointed out the playground one day and suggested Wong should paint it. Wong returned the gesture by hanging Pinheiro's poetry in the sky, in the tradition of Chinese landscape painting, while the signing hands and trompe l'oeil plaque at the bottom of the frame quote his monologue from the 1981 film Fort Apache, the Bronx.
This is a real deal, Neil. This ain't no whack attack. I'm gonna rock her world. I'll make her planets twirl.
Pinheiro would become an enduring muse for the artist, a fallen, saint-like figurehead for the Latino community of the Lower East Side, which he effectively initiated him into. His poetry is full of the tough guy language Wong loved, brought up as he was in a loving, upwardly mobile middle-class home. But his imagination was also sparked by his prison stories, his seminal play, Short Eyes, with its overlapping dialogue incorporating prison terminology alongside multiple dialects and languages. The erotic potential of the setting, with its barred doors and lack of privacy, also appealed to Wong's visual imagination, resulting in a series of prison paintings, their cells and spaces honeycombed like they might be in Roman decorative painting. Combining his fascination for the documentary and the ancient, they often have fresco-like surfaces, elements of architectural trompe l'oeil. In Wong's hands, the state penitentiary becomes like a Pompeian villa, with islands of flesh in the walls. Once again, we arrive back at relationships between hard and soft bodies and environments, freedom and incarceration, whether in his fantasy prisons or the neighbourhood exercise yard of his most celebrated work. Attorney Street Handball Court is a panorama of the artist's obsessions, but it's also a panorama of the Lower East Side, in the same vein as his early hippie images of San Francisco, or the imaginary Chinatown of his family past, which he'd explored as the 1980s became the 1990s. The Chinatown pictures drew a certain amount of hostility from Asian American artists for playing into the kinds of stereotype and caricature they were trying to escape. Wong said himself he was more like a tourist in Chinatown, though he also vehemently rejected the politically correct term of Asian American, writing in a diary that he reserved the right to his own Orientalism, reclaiming the term, perhaps as a reaction against the culturally acceptable post-colonial consensus of the time. San Francisco's Chinatown was itself a hodgepodge of cultural references. Commissioned by local businessman Luc Tin Eli in the wake of the 1906 earthquake, architect T. Patterson Ross and engineer A.W. Bergeron rebuilt the original European-looking Chinatown based on their interpretation of centuries-old temples and pagodas. In a bid to leverage back control of the district, which city authorities planned to relocate miles away from the commercial centre, Chinese business owners had decided to play up the exoticism of the place, attracting visitors and tourists and effectively setting the template for every Chinatown across the country. Even the Chinatown Wong's aunt Nora knew as an entertainer in the 1940s, the Chinatown he found himself daydreaming about in the 1990s, would have essentially been a theme park version of itself. All of this plays into Wong's intentionally, sometimes provocatively, hybrid vision and identity. In a 1989 interview with art historian Margot Machida, he said he saw himself in a line of artists who adapted traditional Chinese painting for the Western market. That these artists were his Rembrandts, his Velázquez. Artists like the painter known as Lam Qua, renowned for his fluency in Western oil techniques and commissioned by the medical missionary Peter Parker to paint the patients of the ophthalmic hospital he set up in Canton in the mid-1800s. The paintings of local people suffering from large tumours in some ways prefigure Wong as a social documentarian and synthesizer of visual languages, a painterly gonzo journalist who nevertheless leaves room for expression and empathy human experience, individuality, and dignity, for all his gleeful leaning into the lurid or grotesque. In her introductory lecture to the online catalogue raison, Machida also links Wong to the artist's brother, the painter known as Ting Qua, who he perhaps encountered in the form of this striking portrait of a Canton merchant while working in the Met's bookstore. Ting Qua and his studio assistants were able to work freely between Chinese and European pictorial vocabularies, sometimes within a single picture album, perhaps best illustrated in this idealized depiction of the studio, with its ultra-cosmopolitan mix of languages. Machida goes on to compare the studio picture to Wong's 1992 painting of the Chinese telephone exchange, a setting he would presumably have loved for its overlap between public space and intimate transaction, communication and privacy, technological modernism and cultural nostalgia. In a similar vein, the commercially produced studio image also exists in several versions, each containing different hidden messages and allusions to Chinese literature, which would have been completely lost on their intended Western buyers. In their subversive play between language and image, information and facade, entry and denial, they can't help but recall the lost world of the neighbourhood depicted in Wong's storefront paintings. A series of signs captured in the process of losing their meaning, the last voices of a street gone quiet. Displayed sitting on the floor in a 1986 Semaphore Gallery exhibition titled The Last Picture Show, the life-sized paintings provided a replica of a Lower East Side neighbourhood already disappearing into gentrification. Wong specifically requested the walls of the gallery be painted mint green for the show, something recreated in every venue for Malicious Mischief. Whether he was inspired by the distinctive green shutters of the Ting Qua studio picture, or by the prison decor in Short Eyes, we can only speculate. Either way, it gives the presentation the institutional feeling of a hospital or mortuary. The storefronts, a kind of funeral procession. In some ways, his most tender, open-hearted works, they are also firmly closed off, speaking of refusal, impenetrability, death. Eventually, the signs recede, language disappears, and we're left only with cold shutters and the dark voids behind. One of the most captivating paintings from the series once existed in two parts, with a yellow sign slotted on top. But the loss of text gives it a greater sense of gravitas, a greater sense of ambiguity. The cool green suggests the gates of a park at night, a location rife with notions of both possibility and danger, tenderness or violence, love or death, heaven or hell. Once again, Wong presents us with a cage that could equally be a gateway to freedom, release, opening up, or clanking down with the roll of the dice. As great as it is to see a comprehensive overview of Wong's work in Europe, a few problems remain. Chiefly, the focus on social context to the exclusion of in-depth pictorial or formal analysis. An understandable curatorial choice in the show, which becomes a bigger problem with the catalogue, as good as it is. Wong's relation to other communities and makers is explored pretty fully. Less so his relationship to other painting. Margot Machida's insights, available on the excellent online catalogue raison, are sorely missed here, particularly in regard to Wong's complex relationship with Chinese art and diaspora. Similarly, very little is done to situate him within a continuity of American urban experience painting, or the wider field of painting in the 1980s, or even 80s and 90s New York specifically. A context where we find unexpected affinities with painters who could seem worlds apart. The early nails in a cement mixer work of Terry Winters, for example. Or the slowed down, sped up, pause, rewind, fast forward language of Christopher Wool. Both artists, Wong was insightfully shown alongside in the Whitney's Painting from the 1980s, a show he not only slotted neatly into, but stood out within. But we could go back even further, and weirder. Perhaps even to the fingertip obsessions of Harold Stevenson or Lambert Maria Wintersberger in the 1960s and 70s. With their strange semaphore of body and sign, their hot and cold language of frustrated touch, surface, and shape. Tellingly, Peter Doig's short statement in an unrelated interview is the most insightful copy printed around the exhibition as far as Wong's achievement as a painter is concerned. Even considering Doig's very early career in the 1980s helps articulate painterly and pictorial ideas that were in the air at the time. He's imagined New York painted in London, buildings and cars, the image of the spaced-out urban cowboy which Wong embodied. Once again showing that as close as he got to the margins, he was never really an outsider. Endemic of the general lack of a painting-specific focus, Wong's cacti paintings are also underrepresented. Either unavailable or just not easily tied to social history enough, they're an unfortunate absence from Malicious Mischief. Spiky yet curvaceous, separate from yet recapitulating so many of the forms and themes in his work, the cacti are a last batch of painting from a time when he was only well enough to paint his mother's houseplants. Something like Derek Jarman's Blue, they perhaps unavoidably speak of AIDS-related dehydration and delirium. After a life spent drinking in the outside world, travelling the hippie trail to Kathmandu, throwing himself into the life of the city, they deal with the interior, the dark room behind the eyes, where Forrest Bess, another great American maverick, saw his ecstatic visions. Cacti are organisms which flourish in the harsh plant prison of the desert, the horticultural equivalent of the city. Like the coyote, perhaps they are a kind of final avatar for Wong himself. One last gesture of cowboy psychedelia. One final act of escapology from a housebound wanderer. Always and to the very end, finding a freedom within the terms of his imprisonment. Writing his valentines to the walls with a bang. A thud